I was sitting at the pine kitchen table, the one I built out of scrap oak back in '88, drinking my first cup of black coffee while the radio hummed low in the background. My wife, Dorothy, whom everybody calls Dot, was at the sink washing our breakfast plates. We've lived in this house on Maple Street for 41 years. I've painted it 4 times myself, replaced the gutters twice, and I know every single floorboard that squeaks. Dot stopped humming mid-tune. "Jean," she said, her back still turned to me. "Kyle just sent us an email." Kyle is our 34-year-old son. He works in commercial real estate on the other side of town, drives a leased German car, and was 3 weeks away from getting married to a woman named Brianna. "What does it say?" I asked, setting my mug down. "I don't know," she replied, drying her hands on a dish towel. "It came to your account, but the subject line says, 'Important.' Please read before responding." I pulled out my phone and tapped open the inbox. Kyle had sent it at 5:47 p.m., right at the end of his workday. I opened it, expecting to see a schedule for the rehearsal dinner or directions to the venue. Instead, the opening paragraph laid out a very different message. Kyle wrote that he and Brianna wanted their special day to run with complete elegance, and to ensure there were no distractions or misunderstandings. They had established a strict set of guidelines for immediate family members attending the reception. He used the word guidelines. Rule number 1. I was required to wear a dark gray suit specifically selected and purchased by Brianna's mother. I was strictly forbidden from choosing my own clothes. Rule number 2. Dot had to report to a specific salon 3 days before the wedding to have her hair and makeup styled according to Brianna's approved reference photos. Rule number 3. I was instructed not to wear my daily wristwatch because, as Kyle put it would clash with the aesthetic of the formal photos. Rule number 4. Dot was not allowed to bring her everyday handbag. Brianna would loan her a small, approved clutch for the evening. I froze, staring at the screen. By the time I reached rule number 5, which explicitly banned us from wearing any shade of cream, gold, or off-white, my coffee was stone cold. A tight, heavy pressure settled right in the center of my chest. It wasn't anger yet. It was that sickening feeling you'll get right before you fully process a truth you've been trying to avoid for years. "Jean," Dot called out gently from the sink. "Is everything all right?" "It's just some details about the wedding," I said, trying to keep my voice flat. "What kind of details?" She walked over, her hands still damp, and stood beside my chair. I turned the phone toward her. "He sent us a list of requirements, 25 of them." Dot reached for the screen. I watched her eyes trace the words, and slowly, every drop of color drained from her face. She didn't say a word. She just set her towel on the back of my chair, turned around, and walked out the back door onto the porch. She needed 5 minutes to collect herself before she looked at me again. After 4 decades together, you learn to read those quiet exits. I stayed at the table and kept reading. Rule 6 stated that we were not to initiate conversation with any guests from Brianna's side of the family, unless formally introduced by the couple. Rule 7 hit like a physical strike. I was not permitted to bring up my trade or background during conversation. Kyle wrote that the gathering would feature a high-level professional crowd, and that small talk regarding manual labor or trades would feel out of place. 38 years. For 38 years, I woke up before sunrise, working until my hands were raw, transforming raw timber into custom cabinetry and porch railings that outlasted the people who bought them. I retired 3 years ago not because my hands gave out, but because my left knee finally lost its battle with extension ladders. My son was asking me to pretend that life never happened. Rule 8. Do not share childhood stories about Kyle. Rule 9. Do not show visible emotion during the vows, as it might make other guests feel uncomfortable. Rule 10. Absolutely no dancing or approaching the main dance floor without explicit permission. Rule 11. Limit alcohol intake to a single toast, because Kyle did not want the evening derailed by unfiltered conversation. I have never been intoxicated at a family gathering in my life. Rules 12 through 14 required us to address Brianna's parents exclusively as Mr. and Mrs. Marsh forbade any direct comparisons between our two families and mandated that any gift we intended to give had to be submitted for prior approval. Then came Rule 15. For the duration of the reception, you will be seated at table 14. Anyone who has attended a formal event knows what table 14 means. It's the table pushed against the kitchen doors, right where the catering staff moves back and forth with heavy trays, where the noise from the dishwashers drowns out the music, and where the event photographers never point their cameras. My son was placing his own parents at the overflow table. I skipped down to the final entries. Rule 19 explicitly banned any handmade items or custom woodwork gifts. Rule 25 required Dot and me to sign a written agreement promising not to discuss, publish, or share any details regarding the event for 6 months following the ceremony. I turned the phone face down on the wood. Through the window, I could see Dot standing by the porch railing, looking out at the old oak tree in the yard. The same tree Kyle used to climb when he was 9 years old. Her knuckles were white against the wood. I stepped outside. Dot. She turned around. Her eyes were red, but her jaw was set firm. I saw enough over your shoulder, she whispered, her voice catching on the last word. Why is he doing this to us, Jean? Why would our boy write something like that? I had no answer for her. I wanted a logical explanation, a reason that made sense of the cold, calculated document on my phone. But every sentence was written in a dry, formal tone that sounded completely foreign to the boy we raised. Let's go inside, I said softly. It's getting cold out here. She nodded and passed by me into the kitchen. As she walked past, I heard a tiny, fractured sigh, a sound held back until it couldn't be kept in any longer. She went straight to the sink, turned on the tap, and stood there letting the warm water run over her hands, even though there were no dishes left to wash. I didn't sleep that night. Long before the alarm was set to go off, I got out of bed, pulled on my flannel shirt, and walked through the dark house out to the garage. The space still smelled of cedar shavings, motor oil, and dry timber. I pulled the cord on the overhead bulb and sat down on an old wooden stool beside my workbench. Hanging above me were the hand tools I had arranged by size and trade over 30 years ago. 38 years, I said, out loud to the empty room. 38 years of getting up before dawn, coming home with sawdust in my collar, and working until my fingers were stiff. I remembered when Kyle was 12. He used to come out here on Saturday mornings, sitting on a crate, asking why I used a dovetail joint instead of a butt joint, or why grain direction mattered when cutting oak. I answered every question because a kid who asks honest questions deserves an honest answer. Then my mind drifted to his second year in college. He called us late on a Thursday evening, his voice tight with panic, saying his scholarship had fallen short for the upcoming semester, and he was short $3,000. I told him not to worry. The next morning, Dot and I went down to the credit union. and transferred the money directly to the bursar's office. He never asked where we found it, and we never brought it up again. A 20-year-old trying to find his footing has a fragile sense of pride. And we didn't want to weigh him down. We gave him every advantage we could afford, and plenty we couldn't. As I sat there in the quiet gray light of dawn, my hand brushed against the side of an old oak cabinet I'd built during our first winter on Maple Street. The door swung open slightly, and a small object slid off the top shelf, landing on the bench with a dull thud. It was a small notebook with a faded blue cover, its spine worn thin from years of handling. On the front, in Dot's careful, neat handwriting, was a single word: Kyle. I picked it up and opened the first page. March 1998, it read. Saved money on winter coats this season. Added $47 to Kyle's education fund. I flipped to the next entry. June 1998. Jean worked overtime on Thursday and Friday. Took the $60 difference and put it in the account. Jean doesn't know I'm keeping track of this. He'd tell me not to worry, but every bit helps. My throat tightened. For over 2 decades, my wife had been quietly recording every tiny sacrifice, every skipped medical appointment, every hand-me-down item, and every extra shift, translating them into small amounts set aside for our son. September 2001. Sold my mother's pearl earrings at the jeweler on Orange Avenue. Received $110. Placed it in the fund. Didn't tell Jean. He'd feel guilty. And that's not the point. June 2006. Sold the gold chain from the pawn shop. $340. Told Jean I traded it in for a new strap. I hate lying to him, but he's already up before 5 a.m. every single day I turned. To the final page. Below a clean horizontal line, Dot had written in larger print, total over 22 years, $47,200. This is not a debt. I did not write this down for anyone to pay back. I wrote it down to remind myself that I did right by my boy. No matter what happens, I chose him every single time. Jean, if you're reading this, I'm sorry I kept it from you. You would have tried to stop me, and I couldn't let you do that. I closed the notebook and tucked it carefully into my chest pocket, right against my heart. Outside, the first light of morning was breaking over the oak trees in the yard. I heard the back door click open, and Dot's voice drifted through the screen door, soft and steady. Jean, breakfast is ready. Come inside. I'm on my way, I called back. My voice was steady. A man carries a lot of weight over 68 years, working through cold winters, bad knees, and long days. But standing up from that workbench, feeling that little blue book tucked inside my pocket, I knew exactly what needed to be done. The morning sun was just starting to cut through the clouds on Wednesday when Dot poured my coffee, using that chipped metal percolator we've had since '87. She stood there by the stove, caught me trying to rub the dull ache out of my thigh, and asked the one question she'd been dancing around for 3 months. Does it still hurt? Your leg? Only when the weather turns, I said. It's fine today, Dot. She put the pot down with a hard click, her voice dropping into that warning register she uses when she's tired of me acting like a tough guy. I'm not asking for the tough guy routine, Eugene. I'm asking if it hurts. I looked down at my left leg stretched out under the table. The femur had knitted back together, straight enough, and the quadriceps muscle was mostly reattached. But like the orthopedic surgeon at Orlando Regional had explained in that slow, practice tone doctor's use for permanent bad news, the soft tissue damage around the knee was something surgery couldn't fix. I could walk on it without a cane, But my stride would always have a hitch, especially in the morning, or when a rain front was rolling in. Some mornings it throbs, I admitted. Today's manageable. Dot sat across from me, wrapping both hands around her mug. She looked over the rim with an expression I knew all too well. It was the look of a woman deciding just how much of her anger she was going to let loose. "He came by once, Jean," she said quietly. "5 days in that hospital, and he visited once." "I know, 25 minutes." Her knuckles turned white against the ceramic. "He sat in that vinyl chair by your bed for 25 minutes. Checked his watch, said he had an afternoon meeting, and left. And I stayed in that room every night because I wasn't going to leave you waking up alone in the dark." Dot. Brianna didn't come at all. Her voice cracked on the name, and she set the mug down hard enough to spill coffee over the rim. Not a card, not a phone call. Nothing. My husband was laid up in a hospital bed because he fell off the roof of her house. "It was Kyle's house," I corrected gently. "It's her house, too." Her eyes were bright red, brimming with tears she refused to let fall. "She's the one who picked out the imported kitchen tile. She's the one who picked the paint. She's the one who told you the second-story fascia boards needed replacing because she wanted reclaimed oak instead of pine. And then she couldn't even pick up the phone to see if you survived the fall." I hadn't heard Dot raise her voice like that in years. She isn't a woman who yells or makes scenes. She usually internalizes her pain, processing it quietly until it comes out in careful, measured sentences. Hearing her voice tremble with that much raw fury made my stomach drop the exact same way it did when the ladder slipped out from under me. "I should have hired a crew," I said softly. "Yes, you should have, but Kyle said the estimates were too high." She leaned in, staring right through me. "The estimates were too high, Jean. So at 68 years old, you climbed onto that roof yourself, because that's what you've always done. You fill in every gap Kyle leaves, you never complain, and you pretend like it doesn't cost you a damn thing." I didn't have a rebuttal for that, because every word was true. The accident had happened on a humid Tuesday afternoon in late August. I was replacing the flashing around the second-story chimney, a basic job I'd done 100 times. What I hadn't accounted for was the composite shingles Kyle and Brianna had picked out. They were slicker than the asphalt shingles I was used to, and when I shifted my weight to reach the back edge, my right boot lost traction. My left leg tried to catch my weight, the extension ladder kicked sideways, and gravity took over. The drop took about 4 seconds. It felt like 10 minutes. I woke up in the side yard with the aluminum ladder twisted over my lap and a blinding, tearing heat in my left thigh that was so sharp it almost had a color. I just lay there on the grass, staring up at the pale Florida sky and whispered out loud, "Well, Jean, you've really done it now." Dot had been inside preparing lunch. She heard the metal crash from the kitchen and came running out the back door. The sound she made when she saw me crumpled on the ground is something I've locked away in a corner of my mind I try never to visit. She called 911, held my hand until the sirens arrived, rode in the front seat of the ambulance, and sat in that cold waiting room for 6 hours without eating a bite. Kyle showed up the following evening. He gave my shoulder a brief squeeze, said he was glad I was going to make it, and sat in the corner chair for 25 minutes before mentioning a client dinner he couldn't reschedule. Now, sitting across from my wife at the kitchen table, I watched her wipe her eyes with the back of her hand, taking long, controlled breaths through her nose to pull herself back together. "The wedding is in 3 weeks, she said, her voice dropping back down to a whisper. I know when it is, Dot. We're going. We're going, she agreed, her jaw setting hard. And you're going to walk into that venue on that bad leg. And you're not going to apologize to a single soul for your limp. I looked at her for a long time. The anger in her face had settled, solidifying into something quiet, deep, and frighteningly deliberate. No, she said softly. You don't owe anyone an apology. The morning after Thanksgiving, I was out in the side yard, trimming back the dead branches from our azalea bushes, when I heard the distinct metallic clack of Ray Kowalski's gate latch. After 35 years of living next door to each other, I could identify Ray just by his footsteps on the gravel driveway. He favored his right side. A little heavy, a lingering habit from a hip replacement back in 2019. Happy day after Thanksgiving, Jean, Ray called out, stopping at the property line. Same to you, Ray. I straightened up, placing a hand against the small of my back to take the pressure off my knee. Betty feed you all right yesterday? Fed me enough for 3 men, and then asked why I looked slow, he said, leaning his arms over the top fence rail. Since retiring from the county road department, Ray had grown a thick white beard and a comfortable belly. He looked down at his coffee mug, hesitated, and then looked back up. You got a minute? I gestured to the pile of clippings. I'm not going anywhere. Ray went silent for a moment, staring into his black coffee. That wasn't like him. Ray was a man who usually blurted out whatever was on his mind within the first 30 seconds. This hesitation told me whatever he was holding on to had been weighing on him for a while. I need to tell you something, Jean, he said finally. Something I probably should have brought up months ago. I kept telling myself it wasn't my place to mix into family business. But after seeing how quiet you've been since getting that email, I can't keep my mouth shut anymore. I walked over to the fence, leaning against my side. I'm listening. Travis Cole, Ray said, his tone flat. You remember when he started coming around your place? When Kyle was about 15, I said. 15 sounds right. Ray's jaw tightened. I never cared for that kid. From the first day, I saw him standing out by your driveway trying to persuade Kyle to skip school. I had a bad feeling. You were out on a job site. Dot was working her shift, and Kyle slipped out the side door. I almost ran across the street to stop it, but I told myself to mind my own business. A knot formed in the pit of my stomach. I didn't know about that. There were other times, Ray continued. Over the years, watching them hang out on the porch, something about that Cole kid just rubbed me wrong. The way he talked, always loud, always performing, like he needed an audience to validate him. But it was the stuff he used to say to Kyle about you that really got under my skin. I kept my voice steady. What did he say? Ray looked me straight in the eye. He used to tell Kyle that if he wanted to make something of himself, he needed to look different, act different, and dress different from where he came from. He told him a man who works with his hands all his life builds a ceiling over his son's head. He said if Kyle wanted a real future, he had to put a boundary between himself and the shop. I stood there, perfectly still. The birds in the oak tree above us seemed to stop singing. Kyle never mentioned any of that to me, I said. Of course he didn't, Ray said softly. Because he knew it was wrong, Jean. But he was 17 years old, insecure, and had that boy whispering in his ear every single day about what success was supposed to look like. I took a slow breath, realizing I was gripping a dry azalea branch so tightly the rough bark was digging into my palm. There's one more thing, Ray said, looking away toward the side of my house. About 6 weeks ago, on a Sunday morning, I was out by the far fence line trimming back Betty's rose bushes. Kyle and Brianna pulled up in the driveway. I don't think they saw me behind the trellis. "What did you hear, Ray?" Ray looked back at me, his eyes heavy. Brianna told him, and I remember the exact words because I repeated them in my head 20 times so I wouldn't mess it up. She said, "Your parents need to be seated separately." Kyle, I don't want them at the main family table next to my parents. The dynamic is completely different, and it's going to make everyone uncomfortable. The dry branch slipped out of my hand and fell into the grass. And Kyle's response, Ray added, his voice strained with a mix of anger and regret, was, "Yeah, okay. I'll handle the seating chart." I stared at my neighbor, the man who had watched my boy grow up, who had handed Kyle a $20 bill on every birthday until he turned 18, who had sat in my kitchen drinking coffee and debating high school football for over 3 decades. He didn't push back, I said. It wasn't a question. He just said, "Yeah, okay." Ray set his cup down on the fence post, his hand visibly shaking. "I'm sorry, Gene. I should have told you right then." I kept hoping the boy would grow a spine and fix it himself. I looked down at the grass, then back at my shop, my side yard, and the roof of my house, standing solid against the late autumn sky. "None of this is on you, Ray," I said. "You're a good neighbor." Ray nodded, though he didn't look convinced. "What are you going to do?" I thought about the faded blue notebook resting in the chest pocket of my flannel shirt. I thought about the handwritten numbers on that last page. 22 years of quiet sacrifices adding up to $47,000. "I'm going to build something," I said. An hour after Ray went back inside, Dot called me in for lunch. She had made a pot of tomato soup from scratch, a post-Thanksgiving routine she'd kept for as long as I could remember, using the last of the home-canned tomatoes from our summer garden. We ate in silence for a few minutes, the only sound the clinking of spoons against porcelain. We've been married long enough that silence doesn't feel uncomfortable. It's just the space between thoughts. I made a batch of this same soup for Kyle when he had bad flu last month. Dot mentioned casually, staring into her bowl. I looked up. "I drove a pot over to his place on a Tuesday morning," she continued, stirring her soup slowly. "Because he'd called the night before complaining about a sore throat right before a big sales presentation." Brianna answered the door. She was very polite, took the pot, and said Kyle was resting. "That was nice of you," I said. "Marcus Tillman told me something 3 weeks ago," she said, setting her spoon down and looking directly at me. "He said that same Tuesday morning, maybe 20 minutes after I pulled out of Kyle's driveway, he was driving past their house on his way to the hardware store. He saw Brianna walk out the front door carrying my Dutch oven and scrape the entire pot of soup right into the outdoor trash bin. The soup in my mouth suddenly tasted like ash. She threw it out? The whole pot." Dot's voice was completely level, but her jaw was set so hard, I could see the muscle flexing in her cheek. Marcus said. She rinsed the pot with the garden hose and set it on the porch steps, so it was clean when I went back to pick it up a week later. When I retrieved it, she told me Kyle loved every drop. She picked up her spoon again, staring down at it. I was so happy when she told me that, Jean. I told her I'd make another batch next time he was sick. I reached across the table and placed my hand over hers. "Dot, I'm not telling you this to make you mad," she said quickly, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I'm telling you because Marcus told me, and I spent 3 weeks trying to convince myself he was mistaken. I thought maybe it was a different pot. Or maybe the soup had gone sour in the car. But Marcus isn't the type to invent stories. Marcus and his wife, Jenna, had moved into the house on the other side of us the previous autumn. They were a young couple in their early 30s. He worked in logistics, and she taught second grade at the elementary school down the road. The morning after they moved in, I'd walked over with a sturdy oak bookshelf I'd built from leftover shop material, just to welcome them to the block. They'd been wonderful neighbors ever since. No, I agreed softly. Marcus wouldn't lie about that. There was one other thing, Dot whispered. When we went to see their new place back in September after the renovation. Remember how Brianna met us at the front gate and walked us straight around to the back patio? She said the living room was being repainted and there was drywall dust everywhere. I remember. Jenna mentioned to me last month that she'd stopped by that exact same morning to drop off a housewarming plant, and Brianna invited her right into the living room for coffee. There wasn't any dust, Jean. The painting had been finished for a week. I stared at my wife as the full picture came into focus. Every subtle exclusion, every polite brush-off, every quiet effort to keep us at arm's length. It wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate, methodical campaign to keep us hidden from the life they were building. She marched us around back, I said slowly, like we were service contractors coming to read the meter. Dot didn't shout. She didn't slam her hands on the table. She just sat there in the pale afternoon light, her fingers wrapped around mine with a grip that was surprisingly fierce. I spent months telling myself I was being overly sensitive, she said, her voice trembling slightly. Making excuses for them because he's my son. But there's only so many excuses you can invent before you have to look at the truth. You weren't being sensitive, I told her. You were being a mother. She squeezed my hand tighter. What are we going to do, Jean? I thought about the small blue notebook resting in my flannel pocket. I thought about the raw timber waiting out on the workbench in the garage. I'm going to make sure they get our wedding gift, I said. I started work in the shop before dawn, on Saturday, long before Dot was awake. The piece of oak I wanted had been resting on the bottom shelf of my lumber rack since last spring. It was a 2-inch thick board of quarter-sawn white oak. Dense, perfectly straight-grained, and heavy. Quarter-sawn timber is cut at an angle perpendicular to the tree's growth rings, producing a distinct fleck pattern in the wood that catches the light differently, depending on how you look at it. It takes twice as much labor to process, which is why most modern furniture makers don't bother with it anymore. But it's exceptionally stable, incredibly tough, and built to last generations. I laid the board out on the workbench, standing over it in the dim overhead light for a full minute before picking up my marking gauge. This box needed to be 12 inches long, 8 inches wide, and 5 inches deep. Big enough to hold Dot's notebook, a stack of old family photographs, and a short letter, but small enough to carry comfortably under one arm. I set the fence on my table saw and made the primary cuts with slow, steady pressure. Working with hard timber requires patience. If you rush a cut or force the feed, the blade will burn the wood, leaving dark scars that take hours to sand out. You have to let the tool do the work at its own pace. Dot appeared in the shop doorway, around 9 o'clock, holding 2 mugs of dark roast. She set one on the edge of the bench, watching the pile of freshly cut oak components laid out in order. "What are you building?" she asked softly. "A keepsake box," I said, "for Kyle and Brianna." She went silent. Then, Rule 19 said no handmade gifts. I remember what Rule 19 said. She stepped closer, inspecting the clean layout. The sides, the fitted bottom panel, the top, and the small internal divider I was preparing for the left compartment. "It's a beautiful piece of timber," she remarked. "Quarter-sawn oak," I explained, running my thumb over the smooth edge. "It doesn't warp, it doesn't split, and it doesn't give way under pressure." "What do you want to put inside?" "My blue notebook," she said without hesitation. "And the photos from the tin in the hall closet, the ones from when he was little." I looked at her. "Are you sure about the notebook, Dot?" "I've kept those numbers tucked away for 22 years, Jean," she said, her voice steady and clear. "I wrote them down so I'd remember what it took to raise him. If he wants us to sit at table 14, he ought to see the ledger for the life he's living." I spent the rest of Saturday hand-cutting the dovetail joints for the corners. Interlocking wooden wedges take hours to chisel out by hand, but when assembled, they form a mechanical bond that outlasts glue, nails, or screws. Concentrating on the angle of the chisel and the direction of the grain kept my mind clear. It gave my hands something constructive to do, while my chest felt like it was trapped in a vice. By Sunday afternoon, the box was assembled and clamped. I mounted 2 small brass hinges on the back rail and installed a simple brass latch on the front face. Then I spent 3 hours hand sanding the entire exterior, moving from 80 grit sandpaper down to 220 until the oak felt as smooth as polished stone. That evening I retrieved my smallest carving gouge and hand-engraved a simple inscription onto the center of the lid. "Kyle and Brianna, December 14. When the lettering was finished, I blew away the fine oak dust, lined the interior with a panel of deep red velvet Dot had salvaged from an old jewelry case, and placed the blue notebook on the right side. On the left, I placed a sealed envelope containing 12 photographs. Kyle at his 7th birthday party. Kyle holding his first baseball trophy. Kyle sitting on the tailgate of my pickup truck, covered in sawdust after helping me on a job site, and a copy of the bank ledger from his college fund. On top of the notebook, I placed a folded note written in my own hand. "Kyle, T. We are coming to your wedding because I am your father, and Dot is your mother. And 34 years of loving you doesn't vanish because of a list of rules. This box contains your mother's records from 1998 to 2020. She never intended for anyone to see them. But I believe a man ought to know the true foundation of the house he stands in before he decides who is welcome at his table. Dad." I closed the lid, snapped the brass latch shut, and set the finished box on the corner of the workbench. Dot came out to the shop a few minutes later. She walked over, placed her fingers gently against the carved oak lid, and stood there in silence for a long time. "It's solid, Jean," she whispered. "It'll hold up," I said. On Monday morning, Ray Kowalski came over with a fresh cup of coffee. Looking like a man who'd been pacing his living room since 3 in the morning, I let him in. Through the side door, he stopped in his tracks when he saw the oak box sitting in the middle of the kitchen table. "Is that it?" he asked. "That's it." Ray walked over and stood beside the table, studying the hand-cut dovetails and the brass latch. He didn't touch it. He just stared at it the way a man looks at an artifact in a display case. "Jean," he said, shaking his head slowly, "that is a damn fine piece of work." "Appreciate it, Ray." He pulled out a chair and sat down across from it. "What's the plan?" "Dot and I are driving up to Savannah on Friday," I explained, sitting down opposite him. "Checking into a motel off the highway. The ceremony is Saturday afternoon at 4 at a venue called the Grand Magnolia. We'll arrive at 3:30 like the email said. We'll sit at table 14 by the kitchen doors. and we won't cause a scene. Ray frowned. And the box? Marcus Tillman is attending as a guest, I said. Kyle did some commercial real estate work with Marcus's brother-in-law last year, so they're on the guest list. Marcus agreed to bring the box in with the other presents and place it directly on the head gift table before the reception begins. Ray nodded slowly. So Kyle won't know it came from you until he looks at the lid. He'll see his name carved into the wood, I said. And when he opens it, he'll find his mother's record. Ray took a slow sip of his coffee, staring at the box for another long moment. Then he looked up at me with a quiet, resolute look in his eyes. Betty and I are coming with you, he said. I blinked. Ray, you don't have to. Don't argue with me, Jean, he interrupted, setting his mug down with a firm thump. I've lived next door to you for 35 years. I watched that boy grow up, and I watched you work yourself to the bone to give him every opportunity. If my neighbors are being shoved back by the kitchen doors at their own son's wedding, then that's right where Betty and I belong. Kyle didn't send you an invitation. Kyle didn't invite half the people who actually cared about him, Ray snapped. We're sitting at table 14. Betty already bought her dress. A tight knot in my chest that I hadn't realized was there finally loosened a little. All right, Ray. Thank you. That afternoon, I called Kyle's cell phone. He answered on the third ring, his voice clipped and hurried. The tone he uses when he's at his office desk handling 3 things at once. Hey, Dad. What's up? I've only got a couple of minutes before a client meeting. I'm just calling to confirm that your mother and I will be at the wedding on Saturday, I said, keeping my tone entirely neutral. We'll arrive at 3:30. We'll take our seats at table 14, and we'll follow the instructions in your email. There was a brief pause on the line. Okay. Good. Thanks, Dad. He hesitated, then added, Did you get a chance to look at the suit link I sent over? We'll be dressed appropriately, Kyle, I said calmly. Dad, it's really important that the photos look uniform. We will be dressed appropriately, I repeated, using the quiet, firm tone I used to use on job sites when a subcontractor was trying to cut corners. You don't need to worry about it. A longer pause followed. All right, he said quietly. Brianna wants everything to look cohesive. I understand, I said. Is there anything else you need from us before Saturday? No. That's all. He cleared his throat. Thanks for calling, Dad. You're welcome, son. See you Saturday. I hung up the phone and set it on the table next to the oak box. I sat there in the quiet kitchen, looking out the window at the old oak tree in the yard, wondering how a boy who used to hold the flashlight for me while I fixed plumbing under the sink had turned into a man so terrified of his own origins. Marcus Tillman knocked on our back door later that evening. I brought him into the kitchen, where the box was wrapped in a soft flannel polishing cloth to protect the finish during transit. Marcus picked up the parcel gently, feeling the weight of the quarter-sawn oak. I'll place it right in the center of the head table, Jean, Marcus said, looking me in the eye, right where everyone can see it. Appreciate it, Marcus. He's making a terrible mistake, the young man added quietly. A man who forgets where he came from doesn't have much standing under his feet. We pulled out of our driveway at 6 o'clock on Friday morning, well before the sun cleared the tree line. Dot had been up since 4:30. I'd heard her moving softly around the dark house, packing our bags with the quiet efficiency of someone who prefers action over conversation. I loaded our luggage into the trunk of the Buick, checked the tire pressure out of long habit, and stood in the driveway for a moment, looking back at our house. Maple Street was dark and still, the streetlights casting long shadows across the frost-dusted lawns. Ray's porch light was burning bright next door. Dot came down the front steps, carrying 2 travel mugs. She handed me mine, the one with the chipped handle, and got into the passenger seat without a word. We drove north on the interstate as the sky slowly shifted from black to a pale, cool gray. Traffic was light, mostly long-haul semi-trucks, heading toward Georgia. I kept the Buick steady at 65 miles an hour, letting the highway miles roll under the wheels, while Dot watched the road through the windshield, her hands clasped tightly around her mug. It wasn't until we were passing Gainesville that she finally spoke. "Do you think he'll look at us, Jean?" she asked softly, her eyes fixed on the pavement ahead. "When we walk into that room, do you think our boy will even look us in the eye?" I kept my hands firm on the steering wheel, watching the white lines dash past in the gray morning light. "I don't know, Dot," I said quietly. "I've been wondering the exact same thing." "He's going to look at you, Dot," I said softly, my voice tight. "Last Thanksgiving, his eyes just passed right over me," she replied. There was no bitterness in her voice, only the flat accuracy of a woman stating a fact she'd verified too many times to dispute. We sat at his table for 3 solid hours. He talked golf with Gerald Marsh for 45 minutes. He talked real estate with Travis, and he asked me exactly once if I wanted more sweet potato casserole. I remember. She set her coffee mug down in the holder, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "I made that casserole from scratch. My mother's recipe. I've made it for every single Thanksgiving of Kyle's life." Her voice didn't crack. That smooth, careful control made it hurt even worse. He asked me if I wanted seconds once, then turned right back around to talk to Gerald. I reached over and covered her hands with mine. She flipped her palms up and squeezed tight. We made one stop outside Lake City at a truck stop right next to a Waffle House. I filled up the Buick while Dot went inside. She came back carrying 2 foil-wrapped bacon and egg biscuits, along with a fresh cup of coffee for each of us. We sat in the car with the engine idling and the heater running low, eating in silence. The biscuits were typical Waffle House fare, a bit too greasy, oversized, but carrying that simple, satisfying comfort of food that doesn't pretend to be anything fancy. "Better than a hotel breakfast," Dot said. "Better than most things," I agreed. A tiny, genuine smile touched her lips, reaching all the way to her eyes. I hadn't seen that smile in 2 full weeks, and seeing it now stirred up a quiet warmth deep in my chest. We rolled into Savannah around 11:15. The city drifted into view slowly, the way coastal southern towns usually do. Long oak branches draped with Spanish moss lined the highway approaches, catching the pale, low afternoon sunlight. I've always liked Savannah. It's a town that moves at its own pace, which suits me just fine. The motel was a clean, modest 2-story place on the western edge of town with exterior walkways and a vending machine next to the ice maker. Dot spotted a single can of cheerwine inside the machine. A soda she hadn't seen since a cousin's wedding in North Carolina back in '87. She bought 2 cans, holding them with a kind of solemn care, as if she were carrying irreplaceable treasures back to our room. Our room was on the ground floor, facing the parking lot. Looking out through the gap in the curtains, over the rows of parked cars, I could see the upper floors of the downtown Hilton where Gerald, Susan's Marsh were staying. Kyle had mentioned offhandedly 2 months back that his future in-laws were coming in from Charlotte and that he'd booked them a nice place in the historic district. I stood at the glass watching the high-rise for a moment before drawing the curtains shut and sitting on the edge of the bed. Dot set her cheerwine on the nightstand and sat right beside me, the low hum of the distant interstate filtering through the walls. "Get some rest," I told her. "Tomorrow is going to be a long day." She leaned her head against my shoulder without saying a word. I wrapped an arm around her, and we just sat there on the edge of that motel bed in Savannah, Georgia, two old people stepping into a situation neither of us quite knew how to navigate. After a long silence, she whispered softly, "Jean, I'm glad I married you." I pressed my lips to the top of her head. "Me too, Dot," I said. "Me too." We changed into our clothes inside that quiet motel room. I put on the navy blue suit I'd bought at JCPenney 4 years ago for my brother-in-law's funeral. Not because I didn't have other clothes, but because it was an honest suit. It was well made, it fit right, and it was mine. It wasn't the outfit from the link Kyle had emailed over. That designer suit, listed at $240 from a boutique in Atlanta that Brianna favored. I'd opened that link once and closed it immediately. If I was going to walk into that venue on a mended leg, I was going to do it wearing my own clothes. Dot put on a pale blue dress she'd owned for years and always loved. She stood at the bathroom mirror, carefully pinning her hair up, and when she walked out, her eyes were clear and her chin was set firm. To my eyes, she looked exactly like what she was. A 65-year-old woman who had spent 4 decades raising a family with grace, regardless of who failed to notice. "You look beautiful," I told her. She patted my arm and handed me my jacket. "Don't go getting sentimental on me before we even get there." At 3:15, Ray and Betty pulled into the parking lot. Betty wore a deep burgundy dress, her silver hair styled in a way that made her look 10 years younger. Ray wore his charcoal gray suit, the one he'd bought back in 2017 for his daughter's college graduation. When we shook hands, he looked at me with a steady, unshakable focus that seemed to settle my nerves. We took 2 cars down to the Grand Magnolia. The venue was a restored, historic building on Abercorn Street, complete with tall white columns and wrought iron railings. The kind of place that charged by the hour to project instant prestige. A valet in a red coat took our keys, and I noticed several late model sedans with Charlotte license plates already lined up near the entrance. The Marsh family contingent had arrived in force. At the main doors, 2 young women in matching black dresses stood behind a velvet rope with tablet computers. When I gave my name, the lady on the left ran her finger down the screen and spoke in a bright, practiced tone. "Mr. and Mrs. Stafford, you're at table 14, straight through the main doors, and to your left." I thanked her. Dot took my arm and we stepped inside. The Grand Magnolia was everything Kyle and Brianna had spent months and a small fortune arranging. Tall displays of white orchids rose from every table, and long hurricane glass candles lined the center of the hall. On a high screen behind the main stage, a golden script monogram entwined the letters K and B. Ivory. Coffered ceilings held crystal chandeliers that caught the candlelight, casting a soft, warm glow across the room. Around 200 guests were already seated or milling between tables, their voices hushed in that polite, formal murmur people use when they aren't entirely familiar with one another. Then I heard it. A short, muffled chuckle off to the side. I didn't turn my head. In my 68 years, I've learned that when people snicker at your expense, the worst thing you can do is let them see you notice. I kept walking, letting my uneven stride carry me forward, letting the quiet joke fade into the background behind us. Dot's grip on my arm tightened just a fraction. She'd heard it too. As we passed the front row, I allowed myself one brief glance. Gerald Marsh sat at table 1, naturally. He wore a sharp tuxedo, a broad-shouldered, silver-haired man with the effortless posture of someone used to premier seating. He murmured something to his wife, Susan, holding a hand up, to shield his mouth with the unmistakable expression of a man sharing a private joke. 3 rows back, Travis Cole sat in a suit that carried an unnatural sheen, his eyes locked onto mine for a split second, before he leaned over to Kyle, who was standing nearby greeting guests, and whispered something in his ear. Kyle's mouth twitched. He raised a hand, pressing his knuckles to his lips as his head tilted slightly. That universal habit people have when trying to suppress a smirk they know they shouldn't share. Dot let out a breath, tiny, tight, and held in before it could turn into a sound. "Don't," I whispered, quietly. Not really to her, but to the part of myself that wanted to stop right there and say something that couldn't be unsaid. We found table 14, right where they promised it would be, along the far left wall. It sat close enough to the service doors that the metallic clatter of bussing carts and stacking plates carried over clearly. Ray pulled out a chair for Betty. I pulled one out for Dot, and we sat down. In a grand hall filled with 200 people, sorted by someone's cold calculation of social value. The 4 of us took our places at a table set for 8. I looked at the tablecloth. Crisp white linen, identical to the ones at the front of the room. The hurricane candles were the same size as those on table 1. Somehow, that little detail felt almost comical. "Good view," Ray noted quietly, looking around. "You can see the whole room from here." "Sure can," Betty agreed softly. I looked across the floor toward the gift table near the stage. The oak box sat right at the end of the display, its carved lid catching the warm light of the chandelier overhead. Marcus Tillman, seated over at table 9, caught my eye and offered a single, firm nod. The box was in the room. Whatever was going to happen next was already in motion. The ceremony began promptly at 4. A string quartet near the stage started into a classical piece I couldn't name. But the music carried that formal weight meant to signal an expensive, solemn occasion. The room fell quiet as whispers faded from table to table, settling into the stillness of a crowd focusing its attention. The officiant was a tall man in his 50s with a calm, projection-trained voice. He stepped onto the stage and opened with standard wedding sentiments. Words about commitment, partnership, and the honor of standing as witnesses. I'd heard similar speeches at 4 or 5 family weddings over the years. But for the first time, the familiar phrases felt like they were being spoken in a language I didn't quite belong to. The groomsmen entered first through a side door, lined up in matching charcoal suits. Travis Cole walked among them with a loose, easy stride, looking around as if his presence on that stage was proof of his own importance. He took his mark without looking anywhere near table 14. Then Kyle stepped out. I hadn't seen my son in formal wedding attire until that moment. He stood tall, inheriting his height from my side of the family, carrying himself straight and proud. In his dark suit with an ivory tie. The exact ensemble Brianna had selected. He looked like the kind of man people assume is successful without ever asking for proof. He was 34 years old, handsome, and the boy I had loved unconditionally for over 3 decades. Standing at the front of that hall, he looked like a complete stranger. My throat tightened with a knot I had no words to describe. Kyle took his position, his eyes scanning the crowd with the practiced efficiency of a host checking off rows. When his gaze swept past the left wall, it landed on table 14. It landed on me. For 2 full seconds, we locked eyes across the length of the Grand Magnolia. Then he looked away. Under the tablecloth, Dot's hand found mine. Her fingers were cold as ice, and I squeezed them tight. The bridesmaids made their entrance next, followed by a little flower girl who dropped rose petals with surgical precision. The quartet shifted into the traditional processional, and every head in the room turned toward the rear doors. Brianna stepped into the hall on her father's arm. To give credit where it's due, she was a striking bride. The gown was sleek and fitted, tailored with a sharp elegance. Gerald Marsh walked beside her with a proud smile, fully aware that every eye in the room was fixed on them, soaking in every second of it. He escorted her to the stage, kissed her cheek, and took his seat at table 1, where Susan reached over to take his hand. The service itself was brief. The officiant spoke on shared goals and building a life together. Kyle and Brianna read custom vows they had written on small cards. Brianna's words were polished and confident. Kyle's sounded surprisingly sincere. He spoke about wanting to be a man who shows up, stays steady, and stands strong through difficult times. Sitting at table 14, listening to my son say those words, out loud I felt a heavy, unnamed pressure against my ribs. Beside me, Ray let out a long, quiet breath through his nose. Betty reached across and briefly rested her hand over Dot's. When they exchanged rings and the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, the hall erupted in warm, collective applause. I clapped along with the rest of the room. Dot clapped beside me, her eyes bright and clear. The newlyweds turned to face their guests, and Kyle's eyes scanned the crowd once more. This time, when his glance reached table 14, he didn't pause. His eyes drifted right past us, sweeping across the room, as if our corner was completely empty. The music swelled, and the wedding party began their recessional. As they passed our table, close enough that I could see the pearl buttons on Brianna's sleeves, she turned her head to acknowledge the applause, her eyes gliding over the left wall with a practiced, pleasant smile. She didn't look at Dot. She didn't look at me. Her gaze passed over us, the way a person looks through a pane of glass at something on the other side. Dot's hand went completely rigid in mine. The room broke into the general commotion of 200 people, standing, stretching, and making their way toward the bar. Server staff appeared, carrying trays of champagne flutes, and the master of ceremonies stepped up to the microphone to announce that dinner would be served shortly. He added, with a polished smile, that a special family gift presentation arranged by the bride would take place before the main course. He promised the crowd it would be an occasion to remember. I glanced over at the head gift table. The oak box rested right at the end of the line, exactly where Marcus had placed it. The hand-carved lid caught the light of the nearby chandelier. My left hand rested flat against my thigh, against the mended bone that would never quite be the same, and I waited for what was coming next. The dinner plates had been cleared, and a second round of champagne was circulating when the master of ceremonies took the microphone once again. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced in a smooth, cheerful tone, "before we open the dance floor tonight, Kyle and Brianna have arranged a very special segment. This is a family gift presentation, a tradition they've created for tonight to honor those who helped lay the foundation for their journey together." A ripple of polite applause crossed the room. Brianna sat at the center of the head table, smiling out at the crowd with the absolute composure of a woman who had planned every second of the evening down to the minute. Kyle sat right beside her, an arm resting casually over the back of her chair, looking entirely relaxed. From table 14, I watched the presentation table. An event coordinator was helping organize the items, and I could see the oak box clearly. It was the largest single item on display, and even from where I sat, the carved lettering on the lid stood out under the bright chandelier light. Kyle hadn't noticed it yet. The presentation began with gifts from Brianna's side. Her parents had presented a framed heirloom certificate, along with an envelope, which Gerald Marsh acknowledged with a nod of quiet satisfaction. Two of Brianna's cousins brought up a set of custom silver barware, handled with care and greeted by eager applause from table 1. Photos were taken, and the host kept things moving with crisp efficiency. Then the coordinator picked up the oak box. Beside me, Ray shifted in his seat. Under the table, Dot's knee pressed firmly against mine. The staff member carried the heavy box to the head table, placing it directly in front of Kyle and Brianna. Kyle looked at it up close for the first time. I watched the exact moment recognition hit him. The quarter-sawn oak, the hand-cut dovetail joints on the corners, the brass latch, and the carved inscription across the top. His jaw tightened instantly. Brianna looked at the box, then turned to Kyle with a puzzled frown. Kyle leaned over and murmured a few quick words to her. Whatever he said made her expression turn instantly guarded. It was the look of someone trying to manage an unexpected distraction in front of an audience. The master of ceremonies leaned down to read the card Marcus had attached. "This gift is presented by Jean and Dorothy Stafford," he announced into the microphone, smiling brightly. "The parents of the groom." A polite, scattered round of applause filtered through the room. Kyle placed his hand over the brass latch. "Kyle, maybe we should open that one later in private," Brianna whispered, her voice carrying slightly through the nearby speakers. But Kyle's fingers were already lifting the latch. He raised the lid. Lying right on top was my folded note. He picked it up, unfolded the paper, and began to read the 7 lines written in my plain script. From table 14, I couldn't see his face, but I watched his shoulders. I watched them drop, a subtle, heavy sag, as if the tension he'd been carrying all evening had suddenly given way. He laid the paper down without reading it aloud. Then his hand reached into the box and pulled out the small blue notebook. He held it in his hands, turning it over slowly, the faded blue cover. Dot's neat handwriting across the front. A single word. "Kyle? What is that?" Brianna asked, her voice hushed, sharp with frustration. "It's my mother's," Kyle said softly. Gerald Marsh stood up from his seat at table 1. He was a man who moved by instinct in social settings. Decades of corporate dinners having trained him to step into the center of whatever was happening. He walked over to the head table with the casual authority of a man who assumed his presence was always welcome, taking the notebook right out of Kyle's hands before anyone could stop him. "May I see?" Gerald asked, already turning the cover open. Kyle didn't answer. I wasn't sure he even could. Gerald flipped to the first page. He read the date, then the first entry. And, because Gerald Marsh was a man accustomed to addressing rooms full of people, he read the words right out loud, his booming voice filling the air out of pure habit. "March 1998, he read, his voice carrying effortlessly across the front tables. "Saved money on winter coats this season. Added $47 to Kyle's education fund." The tables near the stage went completely quiet. Gerald turned a page. June 1998. Jean worked overtime Thursday and Friday. put the $60 difference into Kyle's account. Gene doesn't know I'm keeping track. He'd tell me not to worry, but every bit counts. At table 1, Susan Marsh laid her hands flat against the tablecloth, her eyes fixed on her husband. Gerald turned another page. His tone began to shift. The public booming quality faded, replaced by a quieter, far more deliberate cadence. It was the voice of a man reading something he hadn't anticipated. June 2006. Sold my mother's gold chain at the pawn shop for $340. Told Gene I traded it in for a new strap, so he wouldn't feel guilty about working longer hours. He's already up before 5:00 a.m. every single day. The quiet spread outward from the stage like a ripple on still water, moving from table to table. Brianna reached out, her hand catching Kyle's forearm. "Kyle," she whispered urgently, "tell him to stop." Kyle didn't say a word. Gerald Marsh turned to the final written page, his eyes locking onto the bottom lines. He didn't look up. The hall had grown so still that the faint flicker of the hurricane candles seemed like the only movement in the room. Then Gerald read the final entry aloud, his voice stripped of all its easy charm, leaving only the raw weight of the words. Total over 22 years, $47,200. This is not a debt. I did not write this down for anyone to pay back. I wrote it down to remind myself that I did right by my boy. No matter what happened, I chose him every single time. He stopped reading. The room didn't react immediately. It just absorbed the moment, heavy and unmoving. Then, at table 1, Susan Marsh let out a small, sharp breath, covering her mouth with her hand as her shoulders trembled. Gerald closed the notebook gently. He stood on that stage holding the blue book in both hands, looking down at Kyle. The expression on his face wasn't anger or theater. It was the look of a man who had just recalculated a fundamental truth and realized his original math was completely wrong. Kyle's face drained of all color, matching the ivory linen of the table. Brianna stepped forward, her voice rising to reclaim control. "This is a private family matter," she announced to the room, her chin raised. "This was never intended to be." "Excuse me." The voice came from the left wall, over at table 14. Ray Kowalski pushed his chair back and stood up. He was a large man, and his movement drew every pair of eyes in the hall. He didn't reach for a microphone. He didn't need one. Ray had spent 30 years on county road crews, directing heavy equipment over engine roar. He knew how to make a room listen. "My name is Ray Kowalski," he said, his voice carrying clear and steady across the room. "I've been Gene and Dorothy Staffald's next-door neighbor for 35 years. If nobody minds, I'd like to say a word." Nobody made a sound. "I watched Gene Stafford work 80-hour weeks for years, so his son could go to college without carrying a dime of debt," Ray said, his tone as solid as a load-bearing wall. "I watched Dorothy sell her mother's jewelry to cover tuition fees without telling her husband because she didn't want him taking on extra shifts. And I watched Gene climb onto a roof at 68 years old to fix his son's house because a contractor's estimate was too high, and Gene isn't the kind of man who says no to his boy." Ray's voice didn't shake. It didn't rise in anger. It just pushed forward with absolute truth. That fall broke his leg, and it's never going to heal right. He walked into this hall carrying that injury tonight, and I watched people in this room smirk when he came through the door. The energy in the hall shifted completely, not with a loud crack, but in a slow, collective turn as head after head rotated toward Gerald Marsh. It was the look of a crowd watching the final pieces of a puzzle fall into place. Gerald laid the blue notebook back down on the presentation table. His hands lingered over the cover for a moment, almost like he wasn't sure what to do with them after holding something so raw and undeniable. "I didn't up here to embarrass anyone," Ray continued, his voice cutting through the silence. "I'm saying this because the man at table 14 has stayed quiet for far too long. Far too long. And the people who benefited from his silence ought to understand what it actually cost him." Ray took his seat, the scraping of his chair legs against the floor echoing off the high ceiling. The whole room seemed to recalibrate around him. It was that distinct, heavy atmosphere that descends on a crowd when new information completely shatters the picture. They were sold 5 minutes earlier. Then Marcus Tillman stood up from table 9. Younger than the rest of us, he carried himself with the straightforward directness of a guy who'd made up his mind on the drive over and wasn't about to back down. "My wife and I moved onto Maple Street 14 months ago," Marcus said, looking around the room. "The morning after our moving truck pulled out, Gene Stafford walked across the yard, carrying a handmade oak bookshelf he'd built in his shop, just in case we needed a place to stack our boxes. He didn't ask for a thing in return." He turned his eyes toward Brianna. "A few weeks ago, my wife saw something out our kitchen window. She watched you take a full pot of homemade soup that Dorothy had brought over when Kyle was sick, and she watched you scrape every last drop into the outdoor trash bin. Then she watched you rinse the pot with a garden hose before handing it back." He wasn't shouting. He just stated the facts with unwavering clarity. "My wife is a second-grade teacher. She doesn't exaggerate, and she doesn't lie." Brianna's sharp, composed expression flickered, the artificial composure slipping away like paint peeling off a weathered board. "That is completely. I was standing right beside him," Jenna Tillman added from her seat, her voice clear and cutting. "She didn't even stand up. She didn't need to." Brianna swung around to face Kyle, her eyes desperate. "Kyle, say something." Kyle was staring down at the blue notebook resting on the table, staring at it like a man recognizing a reality he'd ignored for years. He didn't say a word. In the heavy silence that followed, Betty Kowalski rose from her seat. At 68 years old and barely 5'3", Betty carried herself with the quiet, unbothered dignity of a woman who had seen it all. She didn't raise her voice. The room was so dead quiet that even a whisper would have carried to the back wall. She didn't look at Kyle, and she didn't look at Brianna. She looked straight at Travis Cole. Travis was sitting 2 rows back, looking smaller by the second. The shiny, high-end suit he'd worn to project success now looked ridiculous on him. His glass had been empty for 20 minutes, but he didn't dare flag down a server because any movement would draw more eyes. Betty looked at him the way she'd look at a weed sprouting in her flower bed. "I know who you are," she said flatly. Travis tried to pull together a quick, charming smile, the automatic reflex of someone used to talking his way out of trouble. "Ma'am, I think you have me confused with—" "I don't have you confused with anybody," Betty interrupted, her voice entirely calm. "You're the boy who used to stand at the edge of Gene Stafford's driveway when Kyle was 14, trying to talk him into sneaking off. I watched you from my front porch more times than I can count. I know your face just like I know every face that grew up on our street." Travis's smile froze solid. "You spent years telling Kyle that his roots were something to be ashamed of," Betty continued. "You told him his father's hard work was beneath him. I know because Ray heard it. Ray told me, and what Ray says is gospel." She tilted her head slightly. "How many times did Gene Stafford feed you at his kitchen table when you were a boy?" How many Saturday afternoons did you walk out of that house with a full stomach, only to spend the rest of the day convincing his son he was too good for his own family? The people at Travis's table shrank back, desperate to distance themselves from him. Travis opened his mouth, but no words came out. "You don't need to answer," Betty said softly, taking her seat. The tension in the hall had reached a boiling point. It wasn't just anger anymore. It was a room full of people, realizing they'd been lied to, passing judgment without saying another word. Susan Marsh stood up from table 1. She walked up to the stage, picked up the blue notebook, and turned to the final page. She read the last line silently, her lips moving slightly as she absorbed the numbers. Then she looked at her daughter, Brianna. "Mom, this isn't the time," Brianna snapped, her jaw clenched tight. "I am asking you a question at your own wedding reception," Susan said, her motherly authority cutting right through the noise. "Did you know Dorothy Stafford saved money for 22 years to support Kyle? That has nothing to do with." "Did you know," Susan pressed, her voice unwavering, "that Gene Stafford suffered a permanent injury, falling off your roof, trying to fix your house?" Brianna's polished facade completely fractured. "He volunteered to do it," she countered, her voice sharp with defiance. "Nobody forced him to climb up there. Kyle asked him to," Ray called out from table 14, still seated. I heard the phone call across the fence. Gerald Marsh stood to one side, his hands stuffed deep in his pockets, staring at his son-in-law. When he spoke, all the light-hearted charm of the evening was gone, replaced by a cold, direct weight. "Tell me one thing, Kyle. When you put your parents back at table 14, what were you actually thinking?" Kyle didn't move. He kept staring at the notebook in his mother-in-law's hands. The dark suit that had looked so impressive earlier now seemed to hang loose on him. He swallowed hard. "That table made the most sense for the layout," he muttered, repeating the excuse he'd rehearsed. Gerald stared at him for a long, silent moment. "That's the line you're sticking with? It made sense for the layout?" Kyle looked up at his father-in-law, then over at his mother-in-law holding the notebook. Finally, his eyes drifted across the length of the hall to table 14. He looked right at me. I didn't turn away, and I didn't say a word. I just sat there in my navy blue suit by the kitchen doors, my left leg aching from the long day, and let my son look at his father. Whatever he saw in my eyes, he had to sit with it. His face twisted into an expression I couldn't quite label. Then, Brianna stepped to the center of the stage, abandoning all attempts at sweet composure. What was left underneath was sharp, defensive, and desperate to regain control. "I have something to say," she announced to the room. "Gene and Dorothy Stafford are good people. Nobody here is questioning that. But there's context here that isn't being acknowledged." Gerald crossed his arms. Susan watched her daughter with a look of quiet dread. "Gene has a pension," Brianna stated, her words coming fast and rehearsed. "Dorothy has retirement accounts. They own their home. They are financially stable, while Kyle and I are starting from scratch. We have a mortgage, student loans, and business expenses. We're trying to build something real." Her voice built momentum as she pushed her defense. "If the people who love Kyle wanted to support him, like that notebook shows, then that support did its job. He's successful. He's here. The sacrifices paid off." The room listened in stunned, uncomfortable silence. Then Brianna delivered the line that sealed it. "They could afford it," she said flatly. "Gene and Dorothy could absorb those costs, but Kyle and I couldn't. That isn't ungratefulness. That's just math." The words hung in the air like a lead weight. Susan closed her eyes. Gerald looked down at the floor, shaking his head. Beside me, Ray let out a low, bitter sound. The sound of a man hearing his absolute worst suspicions confirmed. Under the table, Dot's hand gripped my wrist so tightly I could feel her rapid pulse against my skin. She was holding herself together by sheer willpower. I looked at my wife's profile. Her set jaw, her tight lips, the quiet hurt in her eyes. I thought about her sitting alone at the kitchen table back in 1998, writing down $47 in a blue notebook while I worked extra shifts. I thought about the gold chain she'd pawned and never replaced. I thought about her sleeping in a vinyl hospital chair for 5 nights straight because she refused to let me wake up alone. They could afford it. I pushed my chair back and stood up. I didn't throw a scene or make a loud speech. I just stood up like a man who'd been sitting too long and needed to stretch his legs. My left knee throbbed in protest, but I ignored it. The eyes of the entire room shifted over to table 14. I didn't look at Brianna, and I didn't look at Kyle. I looked down at Dot, who raised her eyes to meet mine. "Dot," I said softly, "let's go home." She looked at me for a second, then let go of my wrist, placed her hands on the table, and stood up beside me with total, unshakable dignity. Ray and Betty stood up at the exact same time, without a word. When you've been neighbors for 35 years, you don't need a signal. I picked up Dot's small handbag from the back of her chair and handed it to her. She took it, slipped her arm through mine, and turned toward the exit. I gave Gerald Marsh a quiet nod as we passed, a simple acknowledgement between two men. "Thank you for reading the notebook," I said. He opened his mouth to reply, thought better of it, and simply nodded back. We walked toward the heavy front doors of the Grand Magnolia. The crowd parted naturally, people shifting in their seats to let us through. My left leg hitched with every step, but I kept a steady pace. As we reached the exit, Ray pressed a firm hand onto my shoulder. A brief, quiet gesture that said everything that needed to be said. Behind us, Brianna's voice cut through the room one last time, sharp and panicked. "Kyle, say something. Tell them." Then the heavy doors swung shut behind us, cutting off her voice completely. All that was left was the cool December air of Savannah, the quiet street, and my wife holding fast to my arm. Dot didn't say a word until we reached the Buick. She stopped beside the passenger door, turned to face me, and let the tears she'd been holding back finally spill over. She pressed her hands flat against my chest, right over the pocket where her notebook had rested for weeks, and whispered, "You protected it, Jean." I covered her hands with mine. "You protected us for 22 years, I told her. It was my turn." We pulled onto Maple Street at 11:47 p.m. The neighborhood was quiet and dark, the winter air crisp and clear. Ray's porch light was burning bright next door, just like it always was. Ray and Betty were sitting on our front porch when we pulled into the driveway. They'd driven back ahead of us, poured a fresh thermos of chamomile tea, and were waiting on the porch chairs under a thick blanket. There was no big dramatic scene, no pity, just two old friends, making sure we didn't come home to an empty house. We sat out on the porch together in the midnight cold, sipping warm tea and letting the silence settle around us. After a long while, Ray looked over at me. "How was the drive back?" "Smooth," I said. He nodded. "Good. That was all that needed to be said." Over the next few weeks, the dust settled into its natural place. Gerald Marsh called 3 days after the wedding. He wanted to apologize for laughing when we first walked into the hall. He admitted he'd read through Dot's notebook twice over the weekend and realized just how blind he'd been to the truth. I accepted his apology, and I meant it. Kyle called on a Wednesday evening. His voice sounded stripped of all the slick corporate polish he'd picked up over the last few years. He sounded younger, uncertain, and real. He admitted he had no idea about the pawn jewelry, the extra shifts, or the permanent damage to my leg. "I should have asked," he said softly. "I should have known." "Yes," I told him quietly. "You should have. We didn't fix 34 years of history in one phone call, and we didn't pretend everything was fine." But for the first time in a long time, it felt like a real conversation between a father and his son. Brianna didn't call, and neither did Travis Cole, which was a welcome relief. By March, the azalea bushes in the side yard began to bloom again, showing fresh green shoots along the trimmed branches. One evening after dinner, I walked out to the shop and pulled down a board of quarter-sawn white oak I'd been saving on the rack. Dot walked in a few minutes later, holding 2 mugs of hot tea. "What are you making?" she asked, leaning against the workbench. "A bookshelf," I said, setting my marking gauge. "For Marcus and Jenna. They mentioned they needed one for their living room." She looked at the rich grain of the oak, then looked up at me with a soft, quiet smile. "It was a good thing we went to Savannah, Jean," she said. I set the gauge against the edge of the wood and drew the first line. My knee felt steady. The shop smelled of fresh cedar, and the porch light next door was right on schedule. "Yeah, Dot," I said, leaning into the work. "It sure was."